While every settler in the valley rushed to mix lime mortar for their cabin foundations before autumn rains arrived, Irish immigrant Cormac O'Neill was stacking stones bare, fitting rock against rock with nothing between them but air. His neighbors called it lazy construction. They called him a penny-pinching fool too cheap to buy proper lime. O'Neill selected each stone with maddening slowness, turning pieces in his weathered hands, testing fits that seemed random to observers, but followed patterns only he could see. He shaped nothing, cut nothing, simply arranged natural stones into walls that rose without a single drop of mortar binding them together. Henry Dawson, the valley's most respected builder, who had constructed 34 structures across 3 counties since arriving from Pennsylvania in 1851, stopped his wagon to watch O'Neill work. "That wall will fall before Christmas," Dawson announced loud enough for nearby workers to hear. "Man's building a stone pile, not a foundation. First hard frost will push those rocks apart like children's blocks." George Pemberton, a wealthy landowner who considered himself an authority on proper construction methods, dismissed O'Neill's technique as Irish ignorance. "They don't have proper building materials in Ireland," Pemberton explained to his fellow landowners at the county meeting. "Poor man doesn't know any better. Pity, really. He'll learn American standards the hard way when his cabin collapses." Then came the devastating earthquake of 1868, followed by the historic flood of 1870 that destroyed half the structures in the Shenandoah Valley. Mortared walls cracked and crumbled as foundations shifted. Dawson's own home split down the middle when his rigid masonry couldn't flex with moving ground. Pemberton lost 2 barns and a smokehouse when floodwaters undermined mortared foundations that shattered under pressure. But O'Neill's dry stone walls, the ones neighbors had mocked as primitive stacking, stood unchanged. Not a single stone had shifted. The walls that experts predicted would collapse before Christmas were still standing 47 years later when O'Neill's grandson inherited the property, while every mortared structure built that same year had required major repairs or complete reconstruction. What did this Irish stonemason understand about flexibility, drainage, and natural stone engineering that American builders with their lime mortar had completely missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Cormac O'Neill knelt in the September grass, his calloused fingers tracing the contours of a limestone slab he'd pulled from the creek bed that morning. The stone weighed perhaps 40 pounds, flat on 2 sides with an irregular edge that most builders would have rejected or shaped with a hammer. O'Neill saw something different. He saw how this particular piece would lock against 2 others already placed, creating a bond stronger than any mortar could achieve. Behind him, the sound of approaching footsteps announced another visitor to his construction site. O'Neill had grown accustomed to the daily parade of curious neighbors who came to witness what they considered spectacular incompetence. "Cormac, I've been meaning to speak with you about your building methods," called out Henry Dawson, dismounting from his wagon with the confident stride of a man who had built more structures than anyone else in the county. Dawson had learned masonry from his father in Pennsylvania and refined his techniques through 16 years of Virginia construction. He considered himself the final authority on proper stonework in the Shenandoah Valley. O'Neill stood slowly, brushing dirt from his worn wool trousers. The Irishman was 52 years old, with hands thickened by 35 years of dry stonework that had begun in County Clare when he was barely 17. His English carried the soft cadence of Western Ireland, though he'd spoken it fluently since arriving in America during the famine years of 1847. "Your walls have no mortar," Dawson continued, gesturing at the foundation rising along O'Neill's building site. "I've watched you work for 3 weeks now. and I haven't seen you mix a single batch of lime. How do you expect stones to hold together without binding material?" O'Neill lifted the limestone slab he'd been examining and carried it to his wall, settling it into position with small adjustments that produced a satisfying click as stone met stone. "In Clare, we build walls for 1,000 years without mortar," he replied calmly. "Roman mortar cracks. Norman mortar crumbles. But dry stone walls my grandfather's grandfather built still stand on hillsides where everything else has fallen." The technical explanation meant nothing to Dawson, who had been taught that mortar was the essential element of proper masonry. American construction methods demanded strong binding materials, lime mixed with sand and water to create rigid bonds that held stones immovably in place. O'Neill's approach, stacking stones with nothing but careful fitting, seemed like a shortcut born of poverty rather than a sophisticated engineering technique. "Mortar is what separates proper building from primitive stacking," Dawson insisted. "Without it, your walls can't resist lateral pressure. First strong wind, first frost heave, first settling of ground, and those stones will shift. I've seen it happen with cheap construction. Your foundation won't last 2 winters." O'Neill continued placing stones, each one selected from the pile beside him after careful examination. He'd spent 2 full weeks gathering materials before laying the first course, sorting stones by size, shape, and character, until he had pieces that would work together like interlocking puzzle pieces. Most builders considered such preparation wasteful when mortar could bond any stones regardless of fit. "Mortar makes walls rigid," O'Neill explained, demonstrating by pressing against his partially completed foundation. The stones held firm, locked by gravity and geometry rather than chemical bonds. Rigid walls cannot move when ground moves. They crack, they split, they fall. Dry stone moves with the earth, breathes with the seasons, drains water instead of trapping it. Flexibility is strength. Rigidity is weakness waiting to fail. The concept contradicted everything Dawson had learned through decades of American construction practice. Strength meant rigidity. Proper walls resisted movement absolutely. The idea that allowing stones to shift slightly could actually increase durability seemed like rationalization for inferior technique. Dawson had built foundations for churches, courthouses, and the finest homes in 3 counties. Every one of them used lime mortar mixed to precise specifications he'd learned from his father. The technique had worked reliably for 16 years, producing structures that clients praised for their solidity and permanence. O'Neill's suggestion that flexibility could outperform rigidity challenged not just Dawson's methods, but his entire understanding of how buildings worked. "I've seen dry stacked walls in Pennsylvania," Dawson continued, unwilling to abandon his position. "Farmers use them for field boundaries where collapse doesn't matter. But load-bearing construction requires proper bonding. Your foundation will carry the weight of an entire cabin. When those walls start settling, stones will shift and your whole structure will twist itself apart." O'Neill lifted another stone from his carefully sorted pile, this one a thick piece with a natural flat surface that would serve as a through stone, tying both faces of the wall together. "Weight helps dry stone walls," he explained, demonstrating how gravity pressed the interlocking pieces more tightly together. More weight above means more friction between stones. Mortar fights gravity with chemistry. Dry stone uses gravity as the mortar itself. George Pemberton arrived later that afternoon on his fine chestnut mare, curious to see the Irish immigrant's progress. Pemberton owned 400 acres of prime valley bottomland and had built his fortune through tobacco cultivation and careful investment. His success established him as the leading voice in county affairs. a position he exercised through constant commentary on matters ranging from agriculture to architecture. "Dawson tells me you're building without mortar," Pemberton called out, not bothering to dismount. His tone carried the condescension of a wealthy man addressing someone he considered beneath serious consideration. "I've seen dry stacking in the old country, peasant construction for people who can't afford proper materials. This is America, O'Neill. We build to higher standards here." O'Neill set down the stone he'd been positioning and regarded Pemberton with patience, born from hearing similar criticism across 2 decades of American construction work. "In Ireland, dry stone walls divide fields for centuries," he replied. "Walls older than any building in this valley, older than America itself. Perhaps the peasants knew something the wealthy forgot." Pemberton laughed, a dismissive sound that echoed across the construction site. "Ancient walls for ancient people. We have mortar now, proper binding materials that create permanent structures. Your pile of rocks might suffice for a sheep pen, but a man's home requires real masonry. I hope you're not planning to raise a family in that death trap." The exchange attracted Thomas Whitfield, a 38-year-old farmer whose property bordered O'Neill's land. Whitfield watched the construction with more curiosity than criticism. He'd noticed something the others had missed: the precise way O'Neill tested each stone before placement, the careful attention to how pieces interlocked, the deliberate patterns emerging as courses rose upon courses. Whatever O'Neill was building, it wasn't random stacking. "The stones seem to grip each other," Whitfield mentioned to his wife Margaret that evening. "No mortar, but they don't wobble or shift when he tests them. There's something deliberate in how he chooses which piece goes where, like he's solving a puzzle only he can see." By early October, O'Neill's construction had progressed enough to reveal his complete technique, and the site drew daily crowds of skeptical observers. The foundation measured 24 feet by 32 feet, rising 3 feet above ground level with walls 18 inches thick at the base, tapering to 14 inches at the top. The slight inward slope, called batter in dry stone terminology, used gravity to increase stability as wall height increased. Most remarkably, O'Neill had incorporated features that seemed pointless to American observers. Every 4 feet along the wall's length, he'd placed through stones that extended the full thickness of the wall, tying both faces together. At the base, he'd laid a course of large, flat stones directly on packed gravel rather than excavated soil, creating drainage that would prevent water accumulation around the foundation. The wall's internal structure revealed additional sophistication invisible to casual observation. O'Neill filled the space between the 2 outer faces with smaller stones packed tightly together, creating a solid core that added mass and stability. He placed each facing stone with a slight downward tilt toward the wall's center, ensuring that rainwater would drain inward toward the packed core rather than penetrating between joints. The core itself contained no soil or organic material that could retain moisture or decompose over time. "Every stone has a job," O'Neill explained when Thomas Whitfield asked about the internal packing. "Facing stones protect the wall from weather. Through stones tie the faces together. Core stones add weight and fill space that could allow movement. Remove any layer and the wall becomes weaker. Together, they create strength no mortar can match." "Man's overcomplicating simple stacking," Dawson observed during one of his daily visits. "Those long stones waste space that smaller pieces could fill. And that gravel bed took 2 days to prepare, when he could have laid stones directly on dirt. If you're going to build without mortar, at least don't waste time on unnecessary features." But Thomas Whitfield had begun keeping detailed notes on O'Neill's construction, recording techniques that seemed unlike anything he'd encountered in American building practice. Whitfield's father had mentioned Irish stonework that outlasted English castles, and something about O'Neill's methodical approach suggested inherited knowledge rather than improvised shortcuts. November brought the first test of the valley's construction methods, and the results began separating theory from performance. A week of heavy autumn rains saturated the ground, followed by 3 nights of hard frost that plunged temperatures below 20 degrees. The freeze-thaw cycle that frontier builders dreaded had arrived early, testing foundations before structures were complete. Henry Dawson discovered the first cracks in his own workshop foundation on November 12th. Hairline fractures appeared where his lime mortar had trapped water that expanded as it froze. The cracks were minor, easily repaired with fresh mortar, but they revealed vulnerability that Dawson's 16 years of experience hadn't anticipated. His rigid bonds, designed to hold stones immovably, had created pathways for the very moisture that would destroy them. George Pemberton's new barn foundation showed similar damage, with mortar joints separating where frost pressure had exceeded the binding material's strength. Pemberton dismissed the failures as minor settling, easily corrected in spring when construction resumed, but the pattern troubled him. 3 different structures on his property showed identical frost damage, suggesting a systematic problem rather than isolated defects. O'Neill's dry stone foundation showed no damage whatsoever. Thomas Whitfield examined the walls carefully after the frost cycle, running his hands along joints that remained tight despite temperature swings that had cracked mortared construction throughout the valley. Water had drained through the deliberately loose-fitted joints rather than being trapped in rigid bonds. When ice formed, it expanded harmlessly through the wall's drainage pathways instead of shattering rigid mortar connections. "The stones haven't moved," Whitfield reported to his wife. "Not a single one. I tested the same spots I marked before the frost, and everything sits exactly where O'Neill placed it. Dawson's workshop has cracks I can fit my finger into, but O'Neill's foundation looks the same as the day he finished it." The phenomenon puzzled American builders who had always associated permanence with rigidity. O'Neill's walls, which should have been weakened by their lack of binding material, demonstrated superior resistance to the very forces that damaged proper mortared construction. The explanation lay in principles O'Neill's ancestors had discovered through centuries of building in Ireland's harsh Atlantic climate. Dry stone walls functioned as drainage systems rather than barriers. Water entering through unfilled joints passed through the wall and exited the other side, never accumulating long enough to cause damage. When frost arrived, ice formed on the stone surfaces, but couldn't generate destructive pressure because the wall's flexibility allowed micro-movements that dissipated force. Mortared walls trapped water in rigid joints where freezing expansion had nowhere to go except through the mortar itself. December brought colder temperatures and additional evidence of the technique's differing durability. Dawson spent 3 days repairing frost damage to his workshop foundation, mixing fresh mortar in temperatures barely above freezing and worrying whether the repairs would cure properly before the next freeze cycle. Pemberton hired workers to address cracks appearing in all 4 of his mortared structures, spending more on winter repairs than the original mortar had cost. O'Neill completed his cabin construction in late November and moved his family into a structure that skeptics had predicted would collapse before Christmas. The dry stone foundation supported walls that rose without a single crack, despite conditions that damaged mortared construction throughout the valley. Interior temperatures remained comfortable with modest heating, as the thick stone walls retained warmth accumulated during daylight hours. The true test arrived in April 1868, when the Shenandoah Valley experienced its most significant earthquake in recorded history. The tremor struck at 4:47 a.m. on April 12th, lasting 23 seconds with intensity that knocked items from shelves and cracked plastered walls throughout the region. The earthquake's impact on construction became apparent as soon as daylight allowed assessment. Henry Dawson found his workshop foundation split by a crack extending 14 feet along the eastern wall. The rigid mortar joints had resisted the Earth's movement until stress exceeded their bonding strength, then failed catastrophically in a single fracture that compromised the entire structure. 3 courses of carefully laid stones had shifted 2 inches out of alignment, creating gaps that would require complete reconstruction rather than simple repair. George Pemberton's losses proved even more severe. His main barn collapsed entirely when mortared foundation walls cracked in multiple locations, allowing the wooden superstructure to twist off its supports. A storage building split down the middle, the crack following mortar joints that had created a weakness plane through the entire wall. His smokehouse, built with particular care using the finest lime mortar available, showed diagonal cracks from foundation to roofline where rigid bonds had transmitted earthquake stress directly through the structure. 23 buildings across the valley suffered significant earthquake damage, with repair costs totaling over $12,000, an enormous sum in 1868 currency. Every damaged structure shared the same construction characteristic: lime mortar joints that created rigid connections between stones. The very binding material that American builders considered essential had transformed natural stone's inherent flexibility into brittle weakness. O'Neill's dry stone foundation showed no earthquake damage. Thomas Whitfield examined the walls the morning after the tremor, expecting to find at least minor displacement from the most significant seismic event in valley history. Instead, he found stones sitting exactly where O'Neill had placed them 6 months earlier. The walls had moved during the earthquake, flexing microscopically as the ground shifted beneath them, then settled back into their original positions when the tremor passed. Whitfield spent 3 hours conducting detailed measurements, comparing his notes from before the earthquake to current positions. He'd marked 24 specific stones along the foundation's perimeter, recording their exact placement relative to fixed reference points. After the earthquake that had damaged every mortared structure in the valley, not one of O'Neill's marked stones had moved more than a fraction of an inch from its original position. The apparent movement during the tremor had been elastic, stones shifting under stress and returning when stress released. "It's like the wall breathed with the earthquake," Whitfield told Dawson when the builder came to examine O'Neill's undamaged foundation. "The stones aren't locked together like mortared walls. They can shift slightly, just enough to absorb movement, then gravity pulls them back into place. Your walls fight the Earth's movement and break. O'Neill's walls move with it and survive." The observation captured the fundamental engineering principle that Irish dry stone builders had discovered centuries before scientific terminology existed to describe it. Dry stone walls functioned as flexible systems that absorbed and dissipated kinetic energy through controlled micro-movements. Mortared walls functioned as rigid systems that resisted energy until catastrophic failure. Against the irresistible force of an earthquake, flexibility proved dramatically stronger than rigidity. Dawson studied O'Neill's construction with the reluctant respect of a professional recognizing superior technique. The through-stones he dismissed as wasteful served as ties that held the wall's 2 faces together during lateral stress. The gravel drainage bed prevented water accumulation that could destabilize foundations during ground movement. The careful fitting of irregular stones created interlocking bonds stronger than any mortar could achieve, mechanical connections that remained effective regardless of conditions. "I owe you an apology," Dawson told O'Neill as they surveyed the undamaged foundation together. "I said your wall would fall before Christmas. It's April, and my workshop is destroyed while your cabin stands perfect. I've been building with mortar for 16 years, and one earthquake proved I didn't understand stone as well as I thought." O'Neill accepted the acknowledgement without pride or vindication. "Mortar is useful for some things," he replied generously. "Quick construction, unskilled labor, uniform materials. But stone knows how to hold stone. Mortar interrupts the conversation between rocks. Sometimes that conversation is what keeps walls standing when everything else falls." The flood of 1870 provided additional validation of O'Neill's techniques. Record rainfall throughout May raised the Shenandoah River 18 feet above normal levels, inundating the valley floor with fast-moving water that undermined foundations and swept away structures throughout the region. The disaster killed 12 people and destroyed property worth over $40,000, making it the worst flood in valley history. Mortared foundations proved particularly vulnerable to flood damage. Water penetrated mortar joints and accumulated behind walls, creating hydraulic pressure that burst stones outward when the force exceeded bonding strength. Pemberton lost another barn when floodwaters undermined his mortared foundation, the rigid structure collapsing into the current when its base washed away. 7 other families saw their mortared foundations destroyed by water pressure that rigid construction couldn't resist. O'Neill's dry stone walls handled the flood without damage because they didn't try to resist water. Floodwaters passed through the unfilled joints as easily as they passed around the stones, generating no accumulating pressure that could cause structural failure. When waters receded, the walls stood exactly as before, with silt deposits between stones that O'Neill simply washed out with a bucket of clean water. The dual disasters of earthquake and flood transformed O'Neill from village eccentric to recognized authority. Families who had mocked his primitive Irish stacking now asked him to construct foundations that could survive conditions their mortared buildings couldn't withstand. The demand exceeded what one man could provide, so O'Neill began teaching his techniques to anyone willing to learn. The teaching process revealed just how much knowledge dry stone construction required. O'Neill couldn't simply demonstrate techniques and expect students to replicate them. Stone selection alone demanded understanding that took months to develop. Students learned to read stone character through weight, texture, grain orientation, and the subtle sound pieces made when tapped together. They learned to identify natural bedding planes that indicated how stones had formed and how they would behave under load. Fitting stones properly required developing what O'Neill called stone sense, an intuitive understanding of how shapes would interact. A piece that seemed perfect for one location might create weakness if placed in another. Students spent weeks fitting and refitting stones until they began perceiving possibilities that remained invisible to untrained eyes. The geometric complexity of interlocking irregular shapes couldn't be taught through verbal instruction alone. It had to be discovered through hands-on practice, guided by experienced correction. Thomas Whitfield became O'Neill's first student, spending 6 months learning stone selection, proper fitting, through stone placement, and the geometric principles that made dry construction work. Whitfield's notes from this apprenticeship, preserved in the Shenandoah Valley Historical Society, provide detailed documentation of Irish dry stone techniques adapted to American materials and conditions. Henry Dawson overcame his professional pride to study under the man whose methods he dismissed as primitive. The experienced builder recognized that his 16 years of mortared construction had taught him habits he now needed to unlearn. Dawson's subsequent work incorporated dry stone principles into foundations throughout the valley, creating hybrid techniques that combined American construction speed with Irish durability. By 1875, dry stone foundations had become standard practice for discerning builders in the Shenandoah Valley. The technique spread through networks of craftsmen who recognized its advantages after witnessing the contrasting performance during earthquake and flood. Construction costs actually decreased because dry stone eliminated expensive lime purchases and time-consuming mortar mixing, while durability increased because foundations no longer required the constant repair that mortared construction demanded. Regional building surveys conducted in 1890 documented the technique's long-term performance. Of 34 mortared foundations constructed in the valley during 1867, only 8 remained serviceable without major reconstruction. Of 12 dry stone foundations built during the same period, all 12 remained structurally sound, with most requiring no repairs whatsoever in 23 years of service. O'Neill's original foundation, the one Dawson had predicted would fall before Christmas 1867, stood unchanged in 1914 when O'Neill's grandson inherited the property. The cabin had passed through 3 generations without a single stone shifting from its original position. Mortared structures built the same year had been repaired, rebuilt, or abandoned, but O'Neill's dry stone walls remained as solid as the day he'd completed them, 47 years of service without maintenance. Modern geological engineering research conducted by Virginia Tech in 1992 confirmed O'Neill's empirical results through controlled testing. Researchers constructed replica dry stone and mortared walls using period techniques, then subjected them to simulated earthquake stress, freeze-thaw cycles, and hydraulic pressure. The testing documented that dry stone walls survived 3.2 times more seismic stress than mortared equivalents, showed 0 frost damage compared to significant mortar degradation, and resisted water pressure that burst mortared walls at 40% of the dry stone failure threshold. Archaeological evidence preserved at O'Neill's original site provides physical documentation of Irish dry stone techniques adapted to American conditions. The Shenandoah Valley Historical Society maintains the original foundation, where visitors can examine O'Neill's through stone placement, drainage system design, and the interlocking stone patterns that created mechanical bonds stronger than any mortar. Contemporary conservation efforts employ dry stone principles identical to those O'Neill applied in 1867. The Dry Stone Conservancy, founded in Kentucky in 1996, trains craftsmen in traditional techniques that modern engineers recognize as sophisticated structural engineering achieved through inherited knowledge rather than formal education. The ultimate vindication of O'Neill's techniques came through survival statistics that demonstrated the life-saving value of traditional knowledge. The earthquake of 1868 and flood of 1870 destroyed 31 structures in the Shenandoah Valley, causing injuries that included 2 fatalities when collapsing buildings trapped occupants. But dry stone construction, had it been widely adopted, could have prevented every structural failure because the technique's flexibility eliminated the brittle weakness that caused mortared walls to collapse. O'Neill's primitive stone stacking hadn't just challenged American building assumptions. It had proven that dismissing traditional knowledge as backward often revealed not their ignorance, but ours.